Welcome to the Baraza. Here we demystify the miseducation of Africa and Africans by tracing our roots, values, and dissect our social issues. Let's talk. Welcome to today's episode. Buckle up, because we're diving into one of history's darkest moments. A moment that involves chainsaws, acid, and the West's charming way of teaching us human rights.
In the dark and tragic history of the Congo, with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu. Taken to Mobutu's headquarters, past a jeering, threatening crowd, Lumumba, but promised the pro-red Lumumba a fair trial on charges of inciting the army to rebellion. Lumumba was removed to an army prison outside the capital, as his supporters in Stanleyville seized control of Oriental province and threatened a return of disorder. Before that, Lumumba suffered more indignities, including being forced to eat a speech, which he restated his claim to be the Congo's rightful premier. Even in bonds, Lumumba remains a dangerous prisoner, storm center of savage loyalties and equally savage opposition.
Our story begins in Congo, 1961, with Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, a man whose dream was to lead his country to true independence. But of course, the dream of an independent, united Congo wasn't exactly on the Western to-do list. I mean, why would it be? When you've got Cold War chess games to play and minerals to extract, African autonomy is a real buzzkill. So what do you do when an African leader starts making too much noise about independence? Well, apparently you call in Gerard Swete, a Belgian police officer who, 40 years later, casually admits, "Oh yeah, I cut Lumumba into 34 pieces and dissolved him in acid." And we're not talking metaphorical cuts here, folks. Chainsaws. Actual chainsaws. Let's pause for a second to appreciate the full barbarity of that statement. Picture this. It's the middle of the African night. Swete and his pals start by getting drunk, because apparently you need liquid courage to hack a man's body apart. They're sweating, they're stumbling, and then the chainsaw comes out. I don't know about you, but this doesn't sound like the conduct of the so-called civilized West. Now does it? It sounds like a scene straight out of a horror movie. But no, this was real life. Swete goes on to say that the hardest part wasn't even the cutting. Nope. The hardest part was the smell of the acid dissolving Lumumba's body. I mean, let's just get this straight. Here's a guy who helped rid Congo of colonial rule, someone who wanted nothing more than to unite his people, and his end comes at the hands of a guy who's chopping him up like he's got a side gig in landscaping. And Swete, he has the gall to wash himself 3 times, but the guilt, well, that never washed off, did it? "I always felt like a dirty barbarian," he says. "Yeah, Gerard, that's because you were." Now, let's not forget the cherry on top. After recounting this macabre episode, Swete basically shrugs it off. And what's the kicker? The West, the very people orchestrating this brutality, are the same ones who preach to Africa about democracy and human rights. Take a moment to like and subscribe, as we journey across the continent on a quest to not only change Africa's narrative, but also educate and entertain. I'm sorry, but are we really supposed to take lessons on morality from the folks who brought us chainsaw diplomacy? It's almost comical, if it weren't so tragically hypocritical. It's like getting a lecture on vegetarianism from a butcher. The death of Lumumba wasn't just another assassination. It was the decapitation of Africa's future, quite literally in this case. His vision for Congo as a free, united nation died with him that night. And you know what rose in his place? Dictators. The kind of leaders who play nice with the West, as long as the money and the minerals keep flowing. And who's left holding the bag? The Congolese people, who got stuck with decades of authoritarian rule, corruption, and economic exploitation. But hey, at least we got some nice speeches about human rights at the UN, right? Now, here's the real kicker. While all this was going on, while Swete was pouring acid over Lumumba's remains, the West was busy putting on a show. They stood on their soapboxes, wagging fingers about freedom and justice, all while orchestrating coups and funding civil wars behind the scenes. These are the people who want to teach us human rights, That's the line that gets me. It's dripping with irony, isn't it? Because what we learned from them was something far different. Suppression, exploitation, and yes, chainsaws. So why are we talking about this today? Why should you care? Because Lumumba's story is Africa's story. It's a reminder that the struggle for real independence, for true freedom, didn't end with the lowering of a flag or the signing of some treaty. It's ongoing. The powers that be never left, they just changed tactics. And the legacy of leaders like Lumumba, those who dared to dream of a united, free Africa, is still being fought over today. And here's where the real anger sets in. Even now, decades later, we're still dealing with the aftermath of colonial violence and interference. Western countries may no longer send in chainsaws, but their economic and political influence continues to keep Africa on a tight leash. They'll tell us about trade deals and foreign aid, but don't be fooled. Those deals come with strings attached. You see, the world hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. So the next time someone tells you Africa needs help from the West to develop, maybe remind them of Lumumba. Remind them of the chainsaws, the acid, and the people who destroyed Africa's future while preaching democracy. And then ask them, who really needs the lesson in human rights? Thanks for joining us this week. Remember Lumumba's story and remember the hypocrisy. We may have to live with the consequences of the past, but we don't have to accept it as our future. Stay aware, stay curious, and maybe keep the chainsaws away from the human rights advocates. Thank you for watching. Join us next week for another demystifying journey.